After World War II, a specific cultural narrative took root across Europe, the myth of Italiani Brava Gente, the humane Italians. It suggested that Italy's colonizers were uniquely mild, less racist, and less violent than their British or German counterparts. The historical records of Libya and East Africa document a different reality: highly coercive, pathological state systems. To operate systems of this scale, the state required a false front. The administration justified the occupation to the Italian public as a missione di civiltà, a civilizing mission, to mask the systemic exploitation required to extract resources and secure land. By utilizing milieu control and moral disengagement, the administration normalized violence against local populations. In this closed system, the colonial state functioned with the clinical dynamics of a macro-scale microcult. When the war ended, that moral disengagement evolved into a state-sponsored negative feedback loop designed to suppress the historical trauma of the occupation. The Brava Gente myth functions as an active mechanism engineered to maintain psychological homeostasis by burying unspeakable knowledge. For historians, analyzing this period requires filtering actual events from a dense layer of state-sanctioned cover-ups and speculative modern rumors. To evaluate any claim, we process it through three strict tiers. First, documented archival, state decrees, camp mortality data, and demographic realities. This is our anchor. Second, scholarly interpretation of intent. Third, unsupported or speculative, housing claims that lack archival roots. To dismantle the Brava Gente myth, we will pass the history of Italian Africa exclusively through this filter. By stripping away speculation, we reveal the irrefutable architecture of state violence. Between 1930 and 1934, the Italian military occupied the Cyrenaica region of eastern Libya. The administration was led by General Rodolfo Graziani. He acted as the architect of a closed, total institution designed entirely for civilian control. Graziani's primary documented strategy was the mass deportation of the civilian population. The objective was to physically sever the anti-colonial resistance from its agricultural and social base. The immediate result of this military occupation was the capture and forced surrender of entire local communities. This state of total submission and constant surveillance was deemed necessary by the administration to clear the land for incoming Italian settler colonialism. Civilians were forced into concentration camps like El Agela and Soluch, total institutions designed to dispense existence. This map and rising bar chart visualize the documented civilian mortality rates across Cyrenaica. By reconstructing survivor testimony and demographic data, historians have proven the massive scale of death within these camps, placing them firmly in the documented archival tier. Graziani's camp system proves the colonial state engaged in the deliberate, systemic destruction of civilian society. The evidence shatters the myth of the mild colonizer. The state's architecture of coercion extended into the intimate sphere, where sexual relationships became regulated mechanisms of control. The occupation created an overwhelmingly male military settler environment, establishing the precise demographic conditions for systemic exploitation. In Italian East Africa, this manifested as madamato, a widely documented system of informal unions or concubinage between Italian men and colonized women. In Libya, mabruchismo functioned as a system of coercive concubinage between Italian officers and local women. These relationships operated within a structure of radical power asymmetry, defined by military occupation, racial domination, and total economic dependence. The colonial administration tolerated and unofficially managed these practices for years, utilizing them to maintain troop morale, enforce order, and project imperial prestige. Sexual exploitation functioned as a structurally embedded feature of the military occupation's hierarchy. The state's management of colonial intimacy shifted abruptly in the late 1930s with the implementation of fascist racial legislation. The pivot occurred via Royal Decree 880 in 1937, which explicitly prohibited Italian citizens from the acquisition of concubines and criminalized interracial marriage. The regime enacted these bans to prevent the blurring of racial categories, prioritizing the purity of a settler empire over the recognition of individual abuse. This timeline illustrates the shift from unofficial tolerance to legal prohibition, driven by the regime's anxiety over mestizaje, mixed heritage descent. Children of mixed heritage destabilized the fascist fantasy of impermeable racial superiority. The long-term sociological impacts on the Tichy children were severe. The state categorized them as a problem to contain, leading to unstable legal status and permanent exclusion from the national community. Fascist law weaponized intimacy, tolerating exploitation when it served military pacification, and criminalizing it the moment demographic segregation became the priority. Understanding this documented history is crucial when evaluating modern claims, specifically the linguistic overwrite hypothesis, the idea that contemporary cultural terms secretly harbor the repressed memory of colonial sexual violence. We return to the evidentiary filter. Mabruquismo is validated by peer-reviewed scholarship as a historical term for colonial concubinage, landing firmly in the documented archival column. However, Mabruquismo and Bambine mania lack credible evidence, falling directly into the unsupported speculative column. The most prominent speculative claim surrounds the term bambino. The hypothesis suggests this word is a semantic overwrite of colonial abuse in Libya. The historical record tells a different story. The term traces to the artist Omara Bambino Mokhtar. His official biography confirms the nickname is a variation of the Italian word for little child, given because he was the youngest in his band. Relying on false cognates is dangerous. It distracts from the documented, systemic nature of real atrocities by encouraging us to chase unverified rumors. The historical erasure of Italian crimes is absolutely real. We cannot fight erasure with speculation. We must rely exclusively on the anchor of archival truth. The post-war Italian state minimized its colonial violence by actively marginalizing war crimes and concentration camp data from public memory, school curricula, and national archives. They relied on a psychological mechanism known as advantageous comparison. By claiming Italians were better colonizers than the Nazis or the British, the state effectively justified its own atrocities. This systems graphic illustrates the mechanics of collective amnesia. The documented reality, the camp data and racial laws, forms a block of unspeakable knowledge, actively pushed out of sight by the continuous negative feedback loop of the Brava Gente myth. The state executed a deliberate institutional overwrite of history. By integrating a cover-up into national self-representation, the administration prioritized systemic homeostasis over historical reality. We have the undeniable weight of mass deportations, starvation in the camps, and the structural coercion of Madamato. True justice for the victims of Italian colonialism requires a strict adherence to facts, stripping away both state-sponsored myths and modern speculative distractions. Acknowledging the state as a closed pathological system, anchored by archival rigor, is the only way to permanently shatter the illusion of the humane colonizer.